The third morning. The food was getting cold. 200 trays. 200 men. Not one of them eating. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien stood at the entrance of the mess hall and tried to understand what he was looking at. White bread. Vegetable soup, still steaming. Coffee going cold in tin cups. In April 1945, most Germans would have fought each other for a meal like that. These men just sat there. He walked in. Nobody looked up. Nobody shifted. The only sound was snow melting off the roof outside. A faint, steady drip. O'Brien moved down the row slowly, looking at the trays, looking at the faces. He stopped at a corporal near the center. Brown hair, a small scar, through his left eyebrow. The man was staring at the table, not at the food. At the table. O'Brien kept it simple. Is something wrong with the food? The corporal looked up. His eyes were calm. Not angry. Settled, like a decision already made and done with. The food is fine, he said. Then he looked back down. O'Brien stood there. Bread. Soup. Coffee. Good rations, same as what the American guards were eating across the yard. He looked at the man again. The man did not look back up. He walked to the next table. A younger soldier this time, maybe 19, with hollow cheeks and blonde hair and hands gripping each other in his lap. The boy was staring at the bread. His knuckles were white. He was holding himself still. O'Brien kept walking. Row after row. Full trays everywhere. He reached the back of the hall, turned around, and looked at the whole room at once. 200 men, who were clearly hungry, sitting in front of food they would not touch. He went back to the corporal, with the scar. I need to understand, O'Brien said. Why aren't you eating? The corporal looked up, took a slow breath. When he spoke, his English was careful and precise. We are soldiers of the 116th Panzer Division, he said. We have standards. The words sat in the air between them. O'Brien looked at the tray, looked at the man, looked at the tray again. You're hungry, he said. The corporal said nothing. O'Brien waited. The corporal looked back down at the table, and that was the end of it. O'Brien turned and walked toward the door. Behind him, the hall was completely silent. The coffee was cold now. He stepped outside into the thin April morning. Snow dripping off the rooftops. A truck engine running somewhere across the camp. Normal sounds. A normal morning. Except for the mess hall at his back, where 200 prisoners of war were choosing to starve rather than eat American food. He lit a cigarette. Then he went to find Lieutenant Parker. That was this morning. The third morning. Before we continue, if this is your first time at WW2 Untold Vault, subscribe now. We tell the stories of World War II that never made it into the textbooks, the real human moments on both sides of the wire. Now, back to the story. His name was Ernst Weber, and 3 days earlier, it had started with a single sentence. The sentence was simple. Weber had stood up on the first morning and said, "We are soldiers of the 116th Panzer Division. We do not eat American rations." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a speech. He looked around the room at the men he had fought alongside, from Normandy to the frozen Ardennes, said those 2 sentences, and sat back down. No one argued. They had surrendered their weapons, their tanks. Everything an army surrenders when a war ends. They had been loaded onto trucks and driven across a broken Germany to this camp outside Munich. But they were still the 116th, still the Wind Hunt, and there were things that could not be loaded onto a truck and taken away. Weber believed that. So on the first morning, and the second, and now the third, 200 men sat in front of food they would not eat. O'Brien's report moved up the chain that afternoon. By the next morning, it was on a desk at 3rd Army Headquarters. The man behind that desk read it slowly, set it down, picked up a pen. Ernst Weber was 28 years old, and he had grown up in a city that no longer existed. Dresden. Winter, 1943. A Tuesday evening, the kind that smelled like coal smoke and cold air coming under the door. Weber sat across from his father at the small table in the back room of the shoe shop. The chessboard between them. His father, hands wide and rough from 30 years of leather and needles, was holding the knight, turning it slowly, thinking. He set it down. Didn't look up. Ernst, when are you coming home? Weber moved his bishop. When it's finished. His father nodded. No more questions. They played until the candle burned low, and then they stopped, and his father put the pieces away one by one, into the wooden box. Outside, the city was still whole. The bridges still stood over the Elbe. The old market square was still the old market square. Weber left the next morning. He took the chessboard with him. It fit in the bottom of his kit bag, wrapped in a spare undershirt. By the time the 116th reached the Hurtgen Forest 14 months later, one corner of the White Rook was chipped off by a shell fragment that came through the side of a supply truck. Weber kept it anyway. The piece still stood. That was enough. Heinrich Klaus had never played chess in his life. He was 19 years old, and he had grown up 40 kilometers from the camp, where he was now a prisoner. 40 kilometers. On a clear day, from the right hill, he could probably see the church steeple of his village. His father grew potatoes and winter wheat on a small plot outside town. His mother had died when he was 7. Klaus had joined up in September 1944, just old enough, just in time to watch the Wehrmacht come apart from the inside. He had never understood the war well enough to believe in it fully. He had just gone because everyone went. And now he was here, 40 kilometers from home, and that distance felt like the cruelest joke anyone had ever told. The 116th Panzer Division had not come to this camp because they walked in. They came because there was nothing left to fight with. From Normandy to the Ardennes to the Rhine, the Windhund had held lines that should not have held against numbers that should have broken them in hours. When the Ruhr pocket closed in April, they had 2,800 men and 10 tanks against 50,000 Allied troops. They held anyway, for as long as holding meant anything. When it stopped meaning anything, they surrendered. The trucks that brought them east passed through cities Weber had known as a young man. Cologne was rubble from the river to the horizon. Frankfurt was gaps and broken walls where streets used to be. Outside one town, he didn't know which one, a group of old men were pulling bricks out of a collapsed building by hand, stacking them in a pile, doing something because doing nothing was worse. A child sat on the curb watching them, wearing a coat 3 sizes too large, no shoes. Weber watched through the slats of the truck until the town was gone. Then he looked at his hands. He was still a soldier of the 116th Panzer Division. That was still true. Whatever else had been taken, his weapons, his tank, his country that no longer looked like his country, that had not been taken. He held on to it the way his father held a piece of leather before cutting it. Carefully, because once you cut, you cannot uncut. Klaus sat across from him on the truck. The boy had not spoken for most of the journey. He watched the same towns go past, the same rubble, the same hollow faces on the side of the road. At some point he stopped looking out and just stared at the floor of the truck. Weber noticed. He didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. At night in the barracks, after the lights went out, Weber set the chessboard on his knee in the dark. He didn't play. He just touched the pieces one by one, feeling the familiar shapes. The chipped rook. The queen, still smooth. The 2 rows of pawns, all present. He didn't know what he was looking for in the dark. But there was a question he hadn't asked himself. Yet, the kind of question a man avoids, until he can't anymore. Whether the thing he was holding onto was the real thing, or just the shape of it. He wasn't ready for that question. Not yet. The first day was almost easy. Weber stood up after breakfast, after the trays had been brought in and left untouched, and looked around the room. 200 men looking back at him. He said what needed to be said. We know who we are. We hold that. Nobody argued. A few men nodded. Someone in the back started singing, an old marching song from the division, low and steady, the kind that had carried them through mud and cold and the long nights before an attack. Other voices joined. The sound filled the wooden barracks and went out, through the walls, into the April air. The American guards outside stopped walking, stood still, listened. Weber sat down and listened too. He let himself feel it, the weight of it, the familiarity of it, because he knew the second day would be harder. He was right. The second morning, the smell came through the walls. The camp kitchen was 30 meters from their barracks. Weber had not thought about that when he made his decision. He thought about it now. Fresh bread first, just after dawn. A warm, yeasty smell that had no business being that strong at that distance. Then meat broth around mid-morning. Then coffee, real coffee, the American kind, that smelled darker and richer than anything the Wehrmacht had issued in 2 years. Weber stood at the window and looked out at nothing. Across the yard, a young American soldier was eating a sandwich beside a jeep, standing in the weak morning sun, not thinking about it at all. Just eating. The way a man eats, when food is not something he has to think about. Weber watched him for a moment. Then he turned away from the window. Nobody in the room said anything. But he had felt them watching him stand there, and he had felt them watching him turn away, and the silence after was a different kind of silence than the one before. That night he lay on his bunk and listened to the dark. Around him, very quietly, men's bodies were saying what their mouths would not. The sounds were small and involuntary. A shift, a breath held too long, a man turning over for the 4th time in an hour. Weber stared at the ceiling. He put the chessboard on his chest and felt the pieces move slightly with his breathing. He did not sleep. The 3rd morning was different from the moment it started. Men moved slowly, getting up. A soldier near the door had to grip the wall to stand. Another sat on the edge of his bunk for a long time before trying. Weber stood straight. When he rose, he made himself stand straight, but his vision blurred at the edges for a moment, and he put one hand on the bunk frame and waited until it cleared. At roll call, they all stood, lined up, shoulders back, the way soldiers stand. The American lieutenant doing the count looked down his clipboard, looked up at the line, looked down again. He didn't say anything, but Weber saw his expression and understood it. It was not contempt. It was something closer to confusion that was beginning to turn into concern. After roll call, they went back inside. The morning stretched out. Nobody talked much. Klaus sat against the far wall, knees up, looking at the floor between his boots. Weber was standing at the window again, not looking at anything, just standing. When he heard the footsteps behind him, he knew without turning that it was Klaus. The boy stopped a few feet away, didn't sit down, didn't come closer. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and even, the way a person speaks when they have been rehearsing. Corporal Weber. Weber didn't turn. Klaus. A pause. Then, we fought for Germany, not for an empty stomach in a prison camp. Weber said nothing. My father's farm is 40 kilometers from here. Klaus's voice didn't waver. I haven't seen him in 8 months. I would like to go home. The room was quiet. Other men were listening but pretending not to. Weber stood at the window. Outside, the snow on the rooftops was mostly gone now. The sun was thin and pale. A bird crossed the yard, a small brown thing, fast and purposeful, gone before he could see what kind it was. He didn't turn around. I hear you, he said. Klaus stood there a moment longer. Then he walked back to his place against the wall and sat down. The afternoon came in slowly. The light through the windows moved across the floor the way it does when you have nothing to do but watch it. Someone coughed. Someone else coughed. The smell from the kitchen had started again, something warm and heavy, soup or stew, Weber couldn't tell. It came under the door in slow waves. A man near the back, Weber didn't see who, made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The kind a person makes when they stop being able to not make it. No one looked at him. No one said anything. Weber finally stepped back from the window and sat down on his bunk. He picked up the chessboard, set it on his knee. The chipped rook, the smooth queen, the 2 rows of pawns. He moved a pawn forward, looked at it, moved it back. Outside, the light was already thinning toward evening. Somewhere across the camp, a door banged shut. Then quiet again. The long, particular quiet of men waiting. For what? None of them could have said exactly. But something was ending. Weber could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. In the cold coming through the walls. In the stillness of the room. In the way his own hands had started, very slightly, to shake. The jeep stopped at the camp gate just after 2 in the afternoon. Patton got out alone. He said something to the driver, short and flat, and the driver nodded and stayed in the vehicle. 2 guards fell into step behind him as he walked toward the compound. But when he reached the door of the barracks, he stopped and turned and looked at them until they understood. They stopped where they were. He stood outside the door by himself. O'Brien was crossing the yard 20 meters away, and he saw it, saw Patton standing there, not moving, looking at the small barred windows set into the door. Just standing. The 4 stars on his helmet caught the pale afternoon light. He stood there for what O'Brien later said felt like a full minute, though it was probably less. He wasn't doing anything. He was just looking. Then he opened the door and walked in. The room came to attention before anyone decided to. 200 men, 3 days without food, legs unsteady, and they stood. Straight backs, chins level, heels together. The instinct ran deeper than hunger. Patton walked to the center of the room and stopped, and for a moment he said nothing at all. He looked at the men the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand fully before speaking. Then he pulled a chair from the nearest table and sat down. Not in front of them, not above them. He sat the way a man sits when he intends to stay a while, elbows on knees, and he looked at Weber, who was standing at the front of the group. "I know who you are," Patton said. "The 116th Panzer Division. The Wind Hunt." He paused. "The 9th Army called you the best German Panzer Division in the field. They weren't wrong." Weber said nothing. He had prepared for anger, for orders, for the particular coldness of an officer who has already decided the outcome. He had not prepared for this. Patton looked at the trays still stacked near the door from that morning. He looked at them for a moment, not with judgment, just with attention. Then he looked back at Weber. "Where is your father?" he said. The question made no sense. Weber heard it and couldn't place it. It came from the wrong direction entirely, like a knock on a wall where there was no door. "Sir, your father, where is he?" Weber stood still. Around him the room was completely silent. He felt the men watching him, waiting to see how he would handle this, what the correct response was. There was no correct response. There was only the question, hanging there, patient. "He makes shoes," Weber said finally. "In Dresden." He stopped. Then, before he could decide not to, if Dresden is still there, Patton looked at him for a moment. Something moved in his expression, small and quickly gone. "It's still there," he said. He said it quietly, without drama, not as comfort exactly, just as a fact he was giving the man, because the man deserved to have it. Weber said nothing. He felt something shift in his chest, not breaking, just moving, the way ice moves in a river in early spring, slow and irreversible. Patton stood up. When he spoke again, his voice was level and direct, the voice of a man who has never seen a reason to dress a thing up in more words than it needs. "You fought well. I won't take that from you." He looked along the row of standing men, then back to Weber. "But there is a difference between a soldier and a man who lets pride make his decisions for him. One of them goes home, the other doesn't." He let that sit for a moment. "Your country needs men who can build it back. Your families need men who come home. A dead prisoner in an American camp helps nobody, not Germany, not the men who fought beside you, not your father in Dresden." He picked up his helmet from the table where he had set it and held it at his side. "I'm not asking you to surrender anything you haven't already surrendered." He looked at Weber directly. "I'm asking you to still be here when this is over." The room was absolutely still. Weber stood with his hands at his sides. He was aware of everything at once, the cold in the walls, the faint smell of the kitchen drifting through, the faces of the men around him, Klaus somewhere in his peripheral vision, not moving. The chessboard in his kit bag under the bunk. His father's hands turning the night, over and over, thinking, "When are you coming home? When it's finished?" He looked at Patton. The general was watching him, without impatience, without urgency, just watching, giving him the time. Weber took a breath. "If we eat," he said, "do we have your respect?" It was not quite a question. Patton held his gaze. "You have my respect, because you held your men together for 3 days on nothing. That takes something. A beat. Eat. Go home. Build something. That takes more." Weber stood for another moment. Then he turned to the room. 200 faces. Men he had fought beside in frozen forests and burning fields. Men who had followed him into things no man should have to go into. They were looking at him now the way they had always looked at him, waiting, trusting the judgment of the man in front. He nodded once. "Tell them to bring the food," he said. He said it to no one in particular. But O'Brien, who had come to stand quietly in the doorway, was already turning to go. Patton put his helmet back on. He looked at Weber for one more second, something in it that was not quite approval and not quite sympathy, but somewhere between the two. Then he walked to the door. He didn't look back. Klaus was still standing against the wall. He watched Patton leave. He watched Weber sit down slowly on the nearest bench and put both hands flat on the table. Then he looked at the door again, at the empty space where the general had been. He didn't have words for what he had just seen. He didn't try to find them. He just sat down and waited for the food. 3 weeks later, Weber was standing in the food line. It moved slowly in the mornings. Men shuffled forward, took their trays, found their seats. Bread, soup, coffee. The same as always. Weber picked up his tray and turned toward the tables. A man stepped into line behind him. New arrival, transferred in the day before from a camp further west. Young, maybe 20, with the particular look of someone who had not yet understood where he was or how long he would be there. The young man looked at his tray. Then he looked at Weber. "Are we supposed to eat this?" he said. Quiet, uncertain, genuinely asking. Weber looked at him. 1 second, maybe 2. Then he carried his tray to a table and sat down and began to eat. The young man watched him for a moment. Then he sat down too. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. Heinrich Claus was released in the summer of 1945. The paperwork took 3 weeks longer than it should have, the way all paperwork did that year. And by the time he walked out of the camp gate it was July, and the days were long and warm. He had no transportation and no money, and 40 kilometers between him and home, so he walked. It took him 2 days. He slept one night in a barn, whose owner asked no questions, and gave him a piece of bread in the morning, without being asked. The second afternoon he came, over a low hill, and saw the church steeple of his village rising above the tree line, and he stopped walking for a moment, and just looked at it. Then he kept going. His father was in the field when Klaus came up the road. The old man straightened, shaded his eyes, looked for a long time. Then he walked to the edge of the field and stopped there. Klaus came through the gate. His father looked at him, at his face, his hands, the way he was moving, and then nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when the thing he has been waiting for has finally arrived. They went inside. His father put water on the stove. Weber waited longer. The Soviet occupation of Saxony meant that processing took months, and the months became most of a year. He did not arrive in Dresden until the spring of 1946. The city was not what it had been. He had known it would not be. But knowing and seeing are different things, and he stood at the edge of what had been the old market square and looked at the gaps in the skyline for a long time before he moved on. His father's shop was still standing. The building around it had taken damage, one wall patched, with mismatched brick, the upper window boarded over, but the shop itself was intact, and through the glass Weber could see the light on inside. He stood on the pavement for a moment. Then he opened the door. His father was at the workbench, head down, needle moving through leather, with the slow precision of a man who has done this exact thing 10,000 times. He looked up. He looked at his son standing in the doorway. He set the needle down. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then his father pulled out the chair across from the workbench, the same chair that had always sat across from the workbench, and Weber sat down in it. His father went to the shelf in the corner, took down the chessboard, and set it on the table between them. One square in the middle row was empty. A pawn had gone missing years ago, fallen somewhere, never found. Weber opened his kit bag. He reached in and took out the chipped white rook, turned it over once in his fingers, and set it in the empty square. It wasn't the right piece. It didn't belong in that position. But the board was full. His father looked at it, looked at Weber. Then he picked up his own pawn and moved it forward, and the game began. Years later, Klaus would tell the story sometimes, not often, and not to everyone, but occasionally, when the moment was right. He would tell it the way people tell stories that changed something in them, without them fully realizing it, until much later. He would describe the 3 days, the smell from the kitchen, the way the room felt on the third morning, when nobody could pretend anymore. He would describe the man who walked in and sat down and didn't shout. He always said the same thing at the end. We thought not eating made us soldiers. Patton showed us it just made us hungry. The hard thing, the thing that actually took something, was deciding to still be here for whatever came next. Weber never talked about it. That was his way with most things. But the chessboard stayed on the table in his father's shop for the rest of their lives. The chipped rook in the wrong square, the board always set up and ready, the 2 chairs on either side of the table. Some evenings Weber would move a piece, without his father in the room, just to see the position differently, just to think. He never explained why. He didn't need to. If this story stayed with you, leave your answer in the comments below. Every comment is this story being told to one more person. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this, the real human moments of World War II, on both sides of the wire, subscribe to WW2 Untold Vault. We don't tell history. We tell about people.